Lots to cover. First, some news from the world over this week. The U.S. bishops are supporting President Donald Trump's proposal to expand school choice. The plan is, quote, firmly rooted in the teachings of our Catholic faith. This according to Bishop Michael Barber, the chair of the USCCB Committee on Catholic Education. The bishops issued a statement in appreciation following a visit by Vice President Mike Pence and Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos to a Catholic school in Philadelphia. And on Wednesday, the big news of the week, Pope Francis released his apostolic exhortation on the Amazon Synod, which took place back in October. Now, the text, entitled Beloved Amazonia, deals with evangelization, care for the environment and the poor, inculturation of the liturgy, and the role of women in the church. To the surprise and consternation of many, Francis did not address the question of the ordination of married men to the priesthood, as was widely expected. Joining me now with in-depth analysis of the newly released apostolic exhortation and much more is the Papal Posse, editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, and canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray. Thank you both for being here. Gents, I want to start with this issue of celibacy, since, contrary to a lot of people who said we created it, or others created this celibacy controversy, which we'll get to in a moment, it was the most reported and hotly contested issue at that synod. Expectations were high in some circles that Francis would permit limited ordination of married men, relaxing the rule of priestly celibacy. But there was no mention of it at all in the final exhortation. In fact, the Pope reinforced church teaching regarding the unique role of the priest. He had this to say, and then I want your reaction. He says, it is important to determine what is most specific in a priest that cannot be delegated. The answer lies in the sacrament of holy orders, which configures him to Christ the priest. The exclusive character received in holy orders qualifies the priest alone to preside at the Eucharist. This is his particular principle and non-delegable function. Now, your thoughts, first of all, as we said earlier, he doesn't really rule out the ordination of married men. Is this a papal dodge, Father Jerry?
I don't believe so. I think it was a very happy day when the Synod document was issued by Pope Francis, because he was asked by the Synod for two things. One is to have married men ordained priests, and secondly, to have women ordained as deacons. And the Pope did not grant those requests. In fact, as you point out, he talked about the role of the priesthood. He also said the solution for bishops in that area is to pray for vocations and then to also send more people, more missionaries to come in. So I'm very happy because the Pope upheld what I think is an immemorial tradition. I know it to be such, but I think it's also most valuable reality in the life of the Church, unmarried priests.
Robert Royal, he didn't explicitly pronounce on ordaining married men, but he also didn't give progressives what they wanted, and they are angry. I mean, the pieces coming out disappointed, demoralized, painful. Instead, I think the Pope has done in this document is to close the door, some have said. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that the reaction by many people who expected that there would be a change here. I mean, we've even seen people say that he lacked courage to state what they believe he in his heart of hearts really thought. Now, this is always a danger when you set up expectations like this. I mean, I think this is very similar in a way to what happened with the Birth Control Commission way back in 1968 with Paul VI. Everyone assumed that he was going to change it, and then at the last moment, even though his own commission had recommended something, he did something else. I'm going to disagree a little bit for once with my colleague, Father Murray.
My goodness. Mark your DVRs. Go ahead.
And it's this. I mean, as many people have said, very early on in this document, the Pope says, I'm not going to quote from the final report of the Synod, because we have that, and I don't want to just pick and choose there. I want to accompany that document, and I really would like everyone to go back and read the whole thing.
Right.
And I think there's a reason why he does that. I think that might have been intended to just leave
Well, I'm going to get into that. Open. We're going to play. We're going to play the press conference, because that is the operating narrative now. I want to go back to something else, Father Jerry, and I'll let you respond to Bob. There is the supposition out there, the narrative, that it was Cardinal Sarah, it was Benedict, it was Mueller, it was Cardinal Brandmuller. These are the people responsible for elevating this celibacy controversy. Can you explode that canard, please? And what impact do you think the Sarah Benedict book had on this, their book on celibacy?
Right. No, when the Pope originally talked about an Amazon Synod, he did so in reference to a Bishop Fritz Lobinger, who'd written a book about ordaining viri probati, about married men being ordained to the priesthood. The Pope then put it on the Synod agenda. He made an advocate of that proposal to ordain married men. Cardinal Hummus from Brazil, he was made the Relator General. He was the one who was basically spearheading the document that came out of the Synod. So there were a lot of expectations, and those haven't been met, of course, by the final decision. And I think it's fair to say that Cardinal Sarah and Pope Emeritus Benedict's book did have an influence on Pope Francis, had influence on a lot of people. What the exact specification when the Pope made his decision not to endorse this proposal, we don't really know. But you know, to say that a controversy that should never have occurred because some recalcitrant people defended the tradition of the church, that is just a basic debating tactic used to end a debate or end a discussion. The Pope himself said we want open discussion in the life of the church. I think that's what he got, and the result in the end, I think, is very good.
Bob, you wrote a column about the function of the exhortation in relation to the final document. I want you to react to this because, as you mentioned a moment ago, some say he did not close the door to ordaining married men, and they point to the fact that in the introduction to this exhortation and at the press conference, they mention the Amazon document and say, you know, this is almost side by side. And there was a controversy about whether this is magisterial or not, whether this is part of the normal magisterium. Now, this is Cardinal Michael Schurzny, Special Secretary to the Synod, reacting to a question about the magisterial nature of this. Watch.
So I would like to ask Cardinal Czerny, you highlighted in the initial part of the exhortation that there is sort of the inclusion of the final document in a sort of magisterium. So this means that from that final document, a bishops' conference can make decisions on the topic of the ordination of married men.
The final document is included in the Holy Father's magisterium. I said that the Holy Father presents the final document to us with his exhortation as proposals made by the Synod, which he encourages the church in the Amazon, the church everywhere, and people of goodwill to read and to appreciate and to benefit from, apply in proportion to the reality in which they find themselves.
The apostolic exhortation does not speak about the approval of the final document. It speaks about presentation, but not approval. Document has a certain moral authority, but does not have a magisterium authority.
That was Cardinal Lorenzo Baldesseri. Bob, first crack. You believe there's credence here, that there might be an opening by presenting the original Amazon document along with this exhortation, that somehow elevates it. Why?
Well, because there's ambiguity. I mean, we know that that's kind of a hallmark of what the Holy Father does. He doesn't like to pronounce definitively on certain questions. So it's out there. I think, though, that what you hear there is that at least for now, and this must be coming from the Holy Father himself, he doesn't want to be hitting that note too hard. In fact, just today, there were some American bishops in Rome who were on their ad limina visits, and he was even denying that married priest was a major part of why he convened the synod in the first place.
That's not what the synod was about.
That it's mostly about the Amazon and you know saving the earth and kind of an integral human ecology and whatnot, and that other people spoke about this. So I think there's a plausible deniability here. But as we've seen in the past, you know, the famous footnote 351 in Amoris Laetitia, which does not say that people can be divorced and remarried and receive communion, but it's hinted that it's there. We've seen that kind of ambiguity in the past can give rise to all sorts of speculation. And I think in this case, the speculation is really very foggy because, in my view, I mean, if I were to say where we ought to go forward from this, and I think this is a very hopeful thing, I began to think this at the end of the Second Family Synod, frankly. I think we take the document as written. We take the black and white words that are written on the page and we say, that's as far as it goes and no farther. And all the rest is speculation, but it is not to be ignored that there's a possibility that something else can come back.
Father Jerry, as a canonist, what does all that we heard from that press conference mean? And is this a backdoor blessing, if you will, to married clergy at some future time?
I don't think it is. I think that's basically just kind of canonical fuzz talk to say it's magisterial, moral influence, all the rest. The magisterium means the teaching action of the Pope, and he taught through his document. The other document was a bunch of suggestions given by a synod.
Yeah, how do a proposal and a request have magisterial
so those
authority?
don't have magisterial value. Now, does this leave a back door? Anything can happen, but I'll just look at it in the context. For 2 years, we've been talking about the possibility of a married clergy, and when the final word came down, there is no married clergy.
Right.
I can't see the Pope turning around and saying tomorrow, okay, who else wants a married clergy? German hierarchy? Let's have a meeting to talk about it with you people. I don't think that's going to happen. I think we should look, though, at the deeper question is, why are we focusing on a married clergy?
Right.
Why is this a solution? This has really little or nothing to do with providing pastoral service to people. This is about getting rid of the discipline of celibacy. We know the German hierarchy is having a series of meetings now to propose that. This has to end that discussion. And I hope the Pope will come forward and say to them, if it's a dead end in the Amazon, it's more than a dead end in Germany. And you've got to avoid it.
Yeah, and the thing that has me scratching my head is we've heard for months, this is, yes, it's about Amazonia, but it also has implications for the universal church. Now we're told by the Pope himself to these visiting bishops, this is just about the Amazon. It was about their little area of the world, and that's all we were talking about. And now these other people are upset because they didn't think I was courageous enough, and that that the Holy Spirit isn't wrong. I'm wrong, he told them. Look, I don't know why we're having these things then. If it's not a big deal, why are we worrying about it? And the other thing, we keep hearing this term, the liturgy should be incarnate. Care for the environment should be incarnate. I'm not quite sure what that means, but why aren't clear answers incarnate in these documents and from the church? This kind of third way that we're hearing from some progressives now in the media, that the Pope has found a third way. We'll just discern our way to the desired outcome that we wanted in the first place. This strikes me as just un-Catholic, silly.
Yeah, look, there's this attempt to go by what he calls contradictions, and there's going to be some sort of a third, synthesis that's going to be various third ways that are going to emerge from these conflicts that are out there. Look, I do believe that he has a burning concern about environmentalism. We've seen that throughout the papacy.
Sure.
And it's one of the central themes of what he's about.
Yes.
But again, we can't overlook the fact, I've said this on this show before, that if that was meant to deal with the Amazon, with certain elements that would have a universal application, why not then hold that meeting in the Amazon itself? Get the bishops together, and they could actually, maybe some of them visit certain places.
And they have climatologists and people coming through the Vatican all the time. Have an environmental.
Instead, they brought it to Rome, and they brought Pachamama as well to Rome, and created the expectation that what was being talked about there was inevitably going to have applications to the Universal Church. So, although we think this is good at this point, I'm always a little bit skeptical because ambiguity never seems to go away.
I am going to ambiguously move on to the next topic. The role of women was addressed, but not in the way progressives had hoped. There was a big move for deaconesses at the Synod, holy orders for women. In fact, the Pope went in the opposite direction in his exhortation. He writes, for centuries, women have kept the church alive in those places. This summons us to broaden our vision, lest we restrict our understanding of the church to her functional structures. Such reductionism would lead us to believe that women would be granted a greater status and participation in the church only if they were admitted to holy orders. But that approach would, in fact, narrow our vision. It would lead us to clericalize women, diminish the great value of what they've already accomplished. Now, Father Jerry, to this Pope, clericalize is a bad word. This is a far cry from what we heard during the Synod.
It certainly is, and it is, for me, a good idea to just stop talking about women deacons. Not only would it clericalize them, it would also uncatholicize them, because it's impossible to ordain a woman a deacon. We've had women who got so-called ordained priests by dissident bishops, and they were excommunicated. Women cannot receive holy orders. This is not a patriarchal imposure on the church. This is the will of God as expressed through Christ's decision at the Last Supper. So, yeah, he talks about the feminine genius within the document about their care for nature and for people. I think we should focus on that. You and I know, anyone who lives in a Catholic parish knows, most of the work that happens pastorally is done between the cooperation between women and priests, because they are the CCD teachers, they're teachers in Catholic schools, they're the ones who basically staff the volunteer
Take
organizations.
care of the altar,
And then look at, where did you learn your faith? My mother taught me my faith, grandmother, all the rest. Women, to say women are unappreciated in the church is an absolute falsehood and a calumny that's used basically to get power and to say, until you put our women in charge of things, we're not going to shut up. People who want to uncatholicize the church are those who are proposing women's ordination, and the Pope has said no.
I want to speak very quickly about the main thrust of this document, which is the 4 chapters dealing with the environment. The Pope calls them dreams. It's a very poetical sequence, and he's talking about environmental concerns, enculturation, protecting the poor, and these are dreams he has. He quotes Pope Benedict and John Paul extensively. What do you think's at play there?
Well, I don't know exactly. I mean, I think that this Amazonian dreaming, as I've called it, is not helpful for the kinds of problems that we're really facing here. Because I've written an entire book about environment and religion, and many of these problems are engineering problems. They're either badly handled or they're well handled. We're not going to go back to primitive existence in the jungle where the trees are whispering to us and there's a cosmic mysticism of life. In a world of 7 billion people, what you're going to have to deal with are some very hard, abstract problems of engineering, of environmental manipulation, to get back to the point where you've got clean waters, clean air, you manage your environment as well as you can. The idea that there's somehow mysticism or prophecy or quoting poets, I mean, I'm in favor of all that. I like reading
You love poetry. Dante?
Yeah, but the idea that that is somehow going to give us anything other than a kind of a warm feeling about what we ought to do, it doesn't just seem to me that goes very far. And that is, the dreams are not only about environmentalism and politics and whatnot. There's also the ecclesial dream, which is chapter 4. So.
Yeah, dreams of our Holy Father. I hope Barack Obama may have to get some residuals there before we're finished here. I need to move on to this. This was, to my eye, it became the symbol of the Amazon Synod. And anyone casually watching, what you probably know of the Amazon Synod was Pachamama, that idol that showed up at the very beginning at a prayer service and then kept reappearing throughout. Now, the Pope talked about using these indigenous symbols going forward. Here's what he writes. It is possible to take up an indigenous symbol in some way without necessarily considering it an idolatry. Father Jerry, that was obviously a reference to the Pachamama controversy that blew up all over the Synod and really dominated it.
Well, I'd say it's possible, but it's not advisable. If you are going in to say, I proclaim a new message, the new message of truth, Jesus Christ, the eternal Son of God, has saved the world by dying and rising from the dead, you don't admit, then you turn around and say, by the way, these false gods that you have here, get rid of them. We're not going to have them around anymore. Paganism is not a beneficent, kind of like nature story in which people get along. Paganism is about fear of pagan gods who are vicious and who hurt people, and you placate them, as the Aztecs did, by killing human beings. Paganism is about primal fears and anxieties that are not remedied because they don't know the true God. It's diabolical in origin and inspiration. The best thing, you want to have an anthropological museum with Pachamama statues there and say this was built, made 20 centuries ago and people thought it was this. That's fine. Don't bring a pagan statue into the Holy See on Vatican grounds and into St. Peter's, have people prostrating themselves, holding it in procession. We hold saint statues in processions, okay? We don't...
Barely.
Yeah,
barely.
Well, that's the tradition.
In time gone by, we did, yeah.
Well, the great Italian saint festivals and all the rest with the bands, that's okay. Yeah. Pagan statues, please, leave them apart because it confuses people. And by the way, people have nothing to do with paganism. like the Mr. Schugel from Austria, he was scandalized by it. Why shouldn't we, the concerns of Europeans and all the rest who say, what are we telling pagan statues have a role in Catholic worship? They have no role.
Because if they have a role in Catholic worship in the Amazon, why can't they have a role in Catholic worship in New York or Washington?
Sure, and what about, hey, let's dig up some Greek and Roman pagan gods and say, well, they're really ancestors of the saints.
They predate it.
No. Get rid of that stuff.
I have to move on. There was a lot of talk this week. Cardinal Mueller believed that this was, Mueller rather, believed that this was a document of reconciliation, Bob. And yet at the same time, there was a lot of fallout around this synod that has and hasn't been reported. Archbishop Georg Gonswein, who is the secretary of the Papal Household, was essentially sidelined. Does this seem, to your eye, payback for his involvement in the Cardinal Sarah Benedict XVI book on clerical celibacy that may have had an effect on this final exhortation?
Well, we can't know for certain, of course, but the clear fact that the person who's the prefect of the Papal Household is disappeared, as they say in Latin America, tells us that something important happened. As usual, the Vatican PR machine mishandled this and said he had his duties were rotated or reassigned or something. But that's obviously a way of saying that he's been removed from the office. It's impossible to say how important that book may have been in the final decisions that the Holy Father had to make. But it's clear that the fact that that was out there raised the stakes, I think, to a quite high level. And so the Holy Father may have already had his doubts. He may have wanted to put off, he has that phrase that he uses all the time, that it's more important to start processes than to dominate spaces, by which he means make decisions and impose them everywhere. So it's his natural inclination to put things off, and Sarah and Benedict really put him on the spot in a way. But that may just have hurried him along. Unfortunately, Gonswein, who I think was trying to split the difference or smooth over whatever was going on between the two different sides, I think that he, first of all, he made a number of missteps and then paid a price for it.
Sandro Magister's reporting extensively on this, some exclusive stuff, Father Jerry, about how this transpired. It does appear he was caught in the crossfire here.
It really does, because there was a direct contradiction between what Archbishop Genswein said on Monday of that week and then what was revealed by Cardinal Sarah. Genswein said that there was a misunderstanding between Sarah and Pope Emeritus Benedict. Then Cardinal Sarah produced 3 letters, showed there was no misunderstanding, and then Cardinal Sarah met with Pope Benedict twice on the Friday of that week and issued 3 tweets at the end, Cardinal Sarah saying, we both came to the realization there was no misunderstanding. So,
and that meeting, by the way, according to Sandro Magister's reporting, is that Pope Benedict picked up the phone while Gonswein was at the public audience and invited Sarah over to his home. So this is done, the very idea that Benedict's kind of out of commission and babbling to himself in the corner is apparently not true.
Not at all. And it's most regrettable because Archbishop Genswein's a very good man and he served the Pope and the Church very loyally. But Cardinal Sarah had to defend the integrity and truth of what happened. This book was not an accident forced on Pope Benedict. This was the result of 2 men's serious concerns to defend the tradition of the Church and the theological understanding of the role of celibacy. Celibacy is not just something that was invented to produce personnel issues,
Or to protect church property.
Yeah, protect church property. This is about being Jesus Christ in a new form, meaning the priest is the icon of Christ. Christ ascends into heaven, but he leaves 12 apostles, and he says, do this in memory of me. And who does that? The priest does it in person of Christ. So it's very unfortunate. I wish the best to Archbishop Genswein, but I'm very grateful for the witness of Sarah and Cardinal Sarah and Pope Benedict, because they did a great thing.
Very quickly, I want to move to Germany for a moment. Cardinal Gerhard Marx, who's the head of the German Bishops' Conference, he announced he's stepping down before the end of his term in March. He was the prime mover of this synodal path. How big a story is this?
Well, I think it's an enormous story because he has been the figurehead, the leader of the German Church, and at the various meetings in the Vatican, he's always been included in a very prominent way. We know that the Germans paid for the Amazonian Synod, and so they had a large stake in what was going on. It's very curious, I think, what's going on in Germany, because there are cardinals like Cardinal Volki who have said that this synodal path that they have in Germany, which has got prelates and lay people together is structurally not in accord with the understanding of what the church is. I mean, the church has an authority to preach from Christ himself, to preach the truth about God and about man. I thought it was hilarious, but problematic, that Cardinal Volke was rebuked by a woman who was a part of one of these committees, saying that model of authority is no longer valid. Now you ask yourself, well, how do we know that model? Well, it's her authority, her personal authority, that model of authority is no longer valid. So
right.
you begin to see the way that this is a self-refuting operation if what you're going to do is have people making decisions on a kind of a democratic basis about what the truth of God and man is according to the Catholic faith. I think that this is going to be very troublesome for the Holy Father going forward. He's tried to rein it in gently in the past, but I think it's going to become a much sharper controversy in the very near future.
I need to get to something that could have a major impact on this upcoming election season. Bishop McElroy in San Diego, Robert McElroy, delivered a speech in his diocese on February 6th where he seemed to elevate climate change over the issue of life in the pantheon of issues Catholics should consider in the upcoming elections. Here's what he said. How can one evaluate the competing claims that either abortion or climate change should be uniquely preeminent in Catholic social teaching regarding the formation of Americans as citizens or believers? The designation of either of these issues as the preeminent question in Catholic social teaching at this time in the U.S. will inevitably be hijacked by partisan forces to propose that Catholics have an overriding duty to vote for candidates that espouse that position. The death toll from abortion is more immediate, but the long-term death toll from unchecked climate change is greater and threatens the very future of humanity. Father Jerry, he seems to be downplaying the life issues at a time when the bishops, we just had Bishop Naumann on here a few weeks ago, say the bishops decided the life issue is the preeminent issue. What's going on here?
There's a lot of obfuscation here. This is not a very helpful discussion. I think this should be put aside. Climate change, what he really means is man-made climate change, i.e. things that we're doing now to produce a change in the climate. You can't verify that and quantify it. You know, that's an impossibility right now on scientific knowledge. Leave that to the scientists. We know right now hundreds of thousands of children, millions are being killed. I think worldwide 50 million children a year die through abortion. The United States has one of the most open abortion laws in all of Western world, the whole world. Abortion is a crime. It's a horrible injustice. It's the premier human rights issue of our time. To then minimalize it by saying, you know, global warming is going to kill more people, this is not helpful at all.
Well, there was just a report that the leader on reducing CO2 levels in the world, the leader is the United States.
Of course, sure.
So it seems our vision is way off, and we see this also in the Democratic primaries. Amy Klobuchar, after Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg, and others closed the door entirely to pro-life Democrats this week, saying, you have no place in this party. Amy Klobuchar said, oh, sure, they're welcome. I supported adoption, but I believe Planned Parenthood should be funded. We should fund abortions abroad. We need to keep Roe v. Wade moving forward. So it seems you have a party that has turned its back on this issue. Why would bishops attempt to somehow confuse or smudge that at this time?
Well, Bishop McElroy, along with Cardinal Cupich, were among the leaders of the opposition during the bishops' meeting for declaring that abortion was the preeminent issue. So it's not surprising the way that they did this. I'd like to encourage the viewers to read an article at the Catholic Thing that Stephen White wrote a couple of days ago called Prudence and Bishop McElroy, because he was making the argument that prudence leads us to think that we ought to also keep it in mind, as we should, possible dangers to the environment.
Sure.
However, Steve says exactly this. There's a moral difference between trying to manage the situation in the global environment, which is complicated, as Father says. We don't really know, and we can't tell where it's going to go, and we've got to keep our eyes open about that. But there's a moral difference between advocating for that and directly willing the death of innocent human beings. So these are entirely different approaches.
They don't occupy the same moral plane, and that is confusing, because then you have Catholics duking it out in the parish hall over, well, but Bishop McElroy said, no, but I'm reading this from the Bishops' Conference. It's confusing to Catholics. So what they do is they throw their hands up and go, I'll just see which guy makes me happy or who makes a better speech. This is the problem. And if you don't teach it, it can have no effect in the public sphere. And that's the other larger difficulty. Final question, and this really runs to everything we've been talking about. Bishop Marcelo Sanchez Sorondo, who is the Chancellor of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, is defending his giving communion to a pro-abortion president in Argentina. He and his mistress were visiting the Vatican recently. Is this illicit, Father Jerry?
No, Archbishop Sanchez Sorondo made a very big mistake, both pastorally and canonically. If someone comes to you who's living as in a marital way with someone they're not married to, and you know this, and it's a public fact because this is not a private citizen, this is the president of the country.
Yeah.
You take him aside and say, you're welcome to come to Mass, but you cannot receive communion. The reason being, your public status as someone who's living in adulterous union with this woman renders you incapable of receiving communion. In addition, you have the moral concern to say, by the way, what benefit are you going to get from a sacrilegious communion? Because the presumption is you know that this is wrong, therefore you're guilty of a mortal sin. Pastorally, you say to people, look, do you think this is right? And if he says yes, you say, well, you're wrong. If he says, I know it's wrong, good, then don't receive communion because you're only further offending our Lord. We have to be concerned with souls here. Well, this president needs to be rebuked.
Sorondo came out and said, it's up to the, and they quoted Benedict's letter to the American bishops years ago, Ratzinger's then letter to them, where he says, look, this is outside. If someone's supporting abortion on demand, they shouldn't be receiving communion, but it's up to the bishop as how to execute that order, how to make that a reality. And he said, well, I made my ruling, and my decision was he can have communion.
Mistake. No. It's wrong. It's not up to an individual bishop who works in the curia to solve this problem. He needs to be rebuked and told you can't receive communion.
Bob?
And he even went further. Our friend Diane Montagna actually interviewed him afterward and said, isn't this a problem? Because we've seen even earlier, there's been this sort of creeping redefinition of the Eucharist, that non-Catholics are being given the Eucharist in So Diane brings this up with him and really, I think, beautifully pressed the point, and he accused her of being a fanatic, as you and others in America are fanatics about pro-abortion politicians. I think that what she was just saying is, look, we take many of us, not only in the United States, we take the Eucharist seriously.
Yeah.
And if you're going to, as Vatican II said, if you're going to regard the Eucharist as the source and summit of the Christian life, you don't just pass it out like crackers to any person who presents himself. Like that was actually what our friend Eugenio Scalfari said about the Pope, another scandalous thing that he said at one point, that the Pope said to him, anyone who comes will receive, whether they're Catholic or in a state of grace or not. So this is I think that this might become another issue that we're going to be following in the very near future, of the nature of communion and who can and cannot receive.
Well, to warp the old Flannery O'Connor line, if the Eucharist isn't what we've been taught it is, who gives a damn? Yeah. Who gives a damn? So it's really up to the Church to defend who that is, and then lay out the opportunities and the guidelines for who can come forward and who can't, and the processes to get there. Gentlemen, thank you as always. We will meet again. Robert Royal, Father Gerald Murray, their commentary can be found at thecatholicthing.org. Check it out.